Hello and welcome to the first video we are doing in a series on the history of Orthodox missions in the second millennium. As a significant amount of research, editing, materials, and time go into these videos, your support on Patreon is greatly appreciated. It allows us to create more content like this and at more regular intervals. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share our videos on social media. This video series would not have been possible without the assistance of one of our outstanding patrons, Alexander. He hunted down and compiled the majority of the sources used in this video. His help was invaluable, and we owe him a gigantic thank you for that. One of the more common claims made against the Orthodox Church by Catholic apologists is the claim that we do not evangelize like the Catholic Church does. Not only is this disturbingly ignorant, but it evinces a very palpable empty triumphalism. Part of this is willful cluelessness, but part of it is also a lack of access to resources that are primarily in languages such as Russian, Serbian, and Greek, and therefore, most Western Christians have never had the opportunity to study the history. In addition, there is also the preconceived notion of what evangelism looks like. Our own concepts of evangelism are created primarily by imperial and colonial era missionaries. Most people simply equate missionary work with popular images of Spanish mission stations in the American Southwest, or white Europeans venturing into the jungles of Africa. When most people think of Russia, they simply think of a cold, backward, and isolated land of tyrannical rulers surrounded by mountains of vodka and bear-hide rugs. Furthermore, it ignores the rather embarrassing fact that most new converts to Christianity in the last 250 years have been made not by Catholics, but by their arch-enemy, the Protestants. The fruitful missions in sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, and much of the non-Islamic parts of Asia have been Protestant missions. Even more embarrassing is that if we want to play the numbers game, Islam has been highly successful in that regard, to the point that there are now more Muslims in the world than there are Catholics. No doubt, this is because of Islam's high birth rates. But even within North America, the high number of Catholics is due largely to the notorious libido of the Irish immigrants and has virtually nothing to do with so-called Catholic missionary work. Now, the East launched many missions in the first millennium. St. Athanasius consecrated bishops to undertake missionary work in Ethiopia and Nubia in the 4th century. And Christianity in Nubia, in the non-Chalcedonian variety, lasted into the mid-2nd millennium. Under the Emperor St. Justinian in the 6th century, the region that is now eastern Turkey was converted from paganism. In the 9th century, under St. Photius the Great, Saints Cyril and Methodius were dispatched to the Abbasid court in Baghdad on an imperial mission, but with the double mission of converting the caliph. They were successful in converting the caliph's brother and several of his relatives after a public debate in which St. Cyril, who spoke fluent Arabic, debated a Muslim theologian. Saints Cyril and Methodius were also instrumental in the conversion of the Slavs, but prior to this, when Slavic tribes would invade the Byzantine holdings in the Balkans, it was the ordinary people and clergy who did missionary work among the pagan Slavs and would bring them into the Christian fold. Considering how often the Slavs invaded and held Byzantium's Balkans territory, this was an impressive amount of missionary work. We also have the work of the Eastern Patriarchates in converting many monophysites in Anatolia and the Levant during the fallout in the centuries after Chalcedon. So from an early age, large-scale mission work was nothing new to the East, and the vast majority of missionary work was done on an informal level, much as how Christianity spread throughout the Roman and Persian empires in the first 3 centuries. But to add to the fact the Catholic Church did not have a monopoly on successful missions, the Nestorians engaged in a large-scale missionary work between the 5th and 12th centuries, going as far as Japan, fanning out across China and the Asian steppes, and pouring down into India. But the focus of this video will be on the post-schism Orthodox Christian missions. We will use the year 1054 as a convenience date, and we'll start our record after that. The missions in this first video will be broken into the following categories. 1. The Balkans, the Bogomils and Paulicians, re-evangelizing Bulgaria. 2. The Rus, converting the masses. 3. The missions to the north, evangelizing the Finno-Ugaric tribes. 4. The missions to the Baltic nations. And 5. The missions to the south, converting the Turkic tribes. Before we begin, there are a number of maps we have selected in order for the viewers to be able to reference the areas being mentioned. These maps will appear on screen, but for the viewer's convenience, we will also compile a collection of pertinent maps on a page on our blog, and we will have that page linked in the description below. Missions in the Balkans. Throughout Christian history, dualist movements have attempted to attach themselves onto Christianity, and despite typically being known as Gnostics, the name was an umbrella term based on the claims of these disparate groups to possess special and secret knowledge, or in Greek, gnosis, that no one else had. They tended to be heavily dualistic in their worldview, seeing matter as evil and the spiritual realm as good, which caused them to reject material manifestations of grace such as the sacraments, church buildings, and relics. Two very famous groups of Gnostics were the Paulicians, who seem to have originated around Armenia in the 7th century, and their much more successful continuation, the Bogomils, who, it is conjectured, originated in Macedonia in the 10th century. In 970 AD, the Byzantine emperor moved close to 250,000 Paulicians to the Balkans to repopulate the area and act as a bulwark against the Bulgarian Empire. They were settled largely in the city of Philippopolis, which corresponds to the Bulgarian metropolis of Plovdiv. This city became a hotbed and center of the movement, and is the most obvious germination point from where the Bogomils developed, as the Bogomils take their root in roughly the same area and at roughly the same time as the settlement of the Paulicians. Further, if the sources can be trusted, both groups had somewhat similar theology. For example, both were dualists, and both were adoptionists. For this reason, the sources occasionally use the names of the two groups interchangeably. It was not until the late 11th century, in the time of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, that serious attempts were made to convert the Paulicians. In fact, Alexios built the city of Alexiopolis outside of Philippopolis simply to house heretical converts to Orthodoxy, and his daughter, Anna Komnenos, claims that her father, through his efforts, converted most of the Paulicians. She states this in the work The Alexiad, Book 15, Chapter 9. Alexios went to such efforts that he even engaged in public disputations with them while he was in Philippopolis. The remainder of the Paulicians converted in the late 12th century during the reign of Alexios III, shortly before the sack of Constantinople. The Serbian Grand Prince, Stefan Nemanja, whose youngest son was Saint Sava of Serbia, held a council against the Bogomils in 1176 and condemned their heresy. They were expelled from the country and fled to Bosnia, which is why Bosnia was the last stronghold of the heresy in the east. Similarly, councils were held in Bulgaria and Byzantium, condemning the heresy, and by the mid-13th century, the heresy was eradicated in the Balkans except for Bosnia. It was the conquest of the Ottoman Turks that ended any record of Bogomilism in Bosnia. It should be noted that Saint Stefan Nemanja was a convert to Orthodoxy from Catholicism, and it was largely his efforts that kept Serbia on the path of Orthodoxy during an extremely turbulent time. Bogomilism seems to have gone even further underground in the 14th century, and very likely established itself as what was known as the Bosnian Church, which had initially been established as an autonomous church under the Pope. Now, it should be stated that there are debates about the extent of the association between the Bosnian Church and the Bogomils, but the authorities are all in agreement that Bosnia was where the Bogomils concentrated when they were expelled from the surrounding kingdoms, specifically from Serbia. Once the Ottoman Turks conquered the entire region in the mid-15th century, most of the Bogomils rapidly converted to Islam, as disguising their beliefs under the guise of other religions was part of their creed. This is the main reason why Bosnia has such a large Muslim population in relation to other regions. The missionary work in the Balkans was not simply limited to the Bogomils and Paulicians, but also to the Jews. For example, on the death of St. Theophylact, the Archbishop of Ohrid in 1108 AD, Leo Mung was elected to take his place. Leo was an adult convert to Orthodox Christianity from Judaism who, due to his superb prowess in linguistics, had previously been sent to what is now southern Ukraine by the ecumenical patriarch to evangelize the area. He reposed in the Lord in 1120. We also have the conversion of the Bulgarian church back from the Uniates. In the year 1204, the Bulgarian Tsar Kaloyan agreed to enter into communion with Rome and was crowned king of the Bulgarians by the papal legate. The union continued until 1234 AD, when the new Tsar of Bulgaria, Ivan Asen II, went into an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Dukas Vatatzes, and the following year, in 1235, at the Synod of Lampsacus, the ecumenical patriarch, with the permission of the other patriarchs, elevated the see of Tarnovo to that of a patriarchate, and consecrated, came back into the Orthodox Church, with the see of Tarnovo being elevated to patriarchal status, and consecrated the Archbishop of Bulgaria, German, to the patriarchal dignity. As can be seen on screen, this meant a sizable population of Catholics coming back into communion with the Orthodox Church. Helen of Anjou, more commonly known as Saint Helen of Serbia, and mother of both King Stefan Dragutin and King Stefan Milutin, was a convert from Catholicism. She was known for her piety and for building the Gradoc Monastery, St. Nicholas Church in Skadar, and renovating the monastery of St. Sergius and Bacchus. She died in 1314, and her feast day is February 8th. Under King Stefan Dušan, the Serbian state expanded dramatically and conquered many areas with large Catholic populations, one of them being modern-day Albania. Because of this, in the law code of King Stefan Dušan, which was placed into law in 1349, it did not force Catholics to convert, but it made it clear that Catholics, specifically Catholic Albanians, should convert to the Orthodox Church. This was achieved through several means, but one of them was the banning of any Orthodox Catholic marriages unless the Catholic member first converted, and only Orthodox Christians are referred to as Christians, while Catholics are referred to as half-believers. This same law code also enacted harsh penalties against what were left of the Bogomils. The point of mentioning the law code of Stefan Dušan is that the conversions to the Orthodox faith were not just allowed, but also encouraged, thus demonstrating that the idea we are some ethnic ghetto who turned away converts is simply slander. It's a complete lie. Another convert from Judaism, Empress Theodora of Bulgaria, converted to Orthodox Christianity and married Tsar Ivan Alexander of Bulgaria. She served in the capacity of empress from 1331 through 1371 and spent lavishly on the upkeep and construction of churches and monasteries. Her zeal for orthodoxy was so great that she was the main instigator behind the calling of the Council of Tarnovo in 1360, which legislated against Jewish practices. She reposed sometime in the late 1380s, and though she is not a canonized saint, she has been held in high esteem by the Bulgarian Orthodox Church due to her generosity to monasteries and churches. Converting the masses in the Rus territories. When Vladimir of Kiev converted to Christianity in 988 AD, the majority of the conversions came from the upper class and were mostly relegated to cities. The average people, especially in the countryside, remained thoroughly pagan. In fact, even in the year 1100, a city like Novgorod, which, after Kiev, would be the most Christianized, would have been something like 1/3 to 1/2 Christian. Cities further east, like Yaroslavl and Vologda, would be even less Christian. It was not until the early 12th century that most of the inhabitants of the big cities would have considered themselves Christian. Even further, it would be another 3 to 4 centuries before the northern tribes, who were largely Finno-Ugaric and who made up the majority of northern Russia, were majority Christian. For example, in her magnum opus, Medieval Russia, 980 through 1584, Janet Martin points out that, quote, some of the towns, such as Novgorod, Polotsk, and Belgorod, became the centers of dioceses during Vladimir's reign. Elsewhere, the Christian presence was probably little more than a small mission, supplemented by the prince, his retainers, and a few converts. End quote. This situation lasted longer than one would think, as episcopal sees were established slowly. Case in point, the Principality of Smolensk, which was a large city did not have a bishop until 1136, nearly a century and a half after the baptism of Saint Vladimir. Martin continues, quote, "During the 12th century, various indicators, including the popular use of Christian rather than pagan symbols in dress and decorative apparel, signaled that Christian culture was gradually taking hold in Rus society." End quote. And, quote, "Although Christianity officially became the official state religion in 988 AD, it was not readily accepted by the general populace, who remained loyal to their pagan gods, influential priests and shamans, and to the customs and rituals that gave meaning to the most basic human activities." End quote. Now, that takes into account the bigger cities. But in the Rus countryside, the Slavic population accepted Christianity later and only very gradually, probably only once the cities had been largely Christianized. Quote, "The rural society, which clung to tribal traditions reinforced by their communal institutions and elders, internalized Christian behavior and secular legal standards at a slower pace than the urban populace." End quote. This should not be surprising at all, since Christianity has traditionally been a religion that spread quickly in the urban areas. In fact, the term pagan comes from the Latin term paganus, meaning something like redneck or hillbilly. Initially, after the conversion of Saint Vladimir, with the exception of Kiev, none of the large cities had a Christian majority, and the countryside was nearly entirely pagan in the year 1100. Even the city of Novgorod in the year 1100 was at most half Christian, while cities further east, like Vologda, were no more than one-third Christian. Therefore, the first task of the Orthodox Church in the Rus lands was to complete the conversion of the cities, followed by the countryside, and this was accomplished by the early 13th century. So, more than 200 years after Saint Vladimir was baptized, almost 250 years, the Rus principalities were actual Christian societies. Great missionaries during this era include Saint Kushka and his disciple, Saint Nikon of the Kievan Caves, who both were martyred in the year 1114 while converting the Vyaktichi and Radomichi Slavic tribes who lived around Moscow. The same saints were also famous for converting Jews and making many of their new converts into outstanding monastics. When Saint Kushka was killed, Saint Pimen the Faster heard about it by divine revelation and announced it to the monks in the Kievan Caves, before then shortly reposing himself. Saints Kushka and Nikon are commemorated on August 27th. Following in this tradition is Saint Abraham of Smolensk, who is credited with the conversion of the large tribal union in modern-day Belarus, known as the Krivich, along the Dnieper River, their chief tribal center located at Polotsk. He also did missionary work along with the Drevelians, who lived in what is now northern Ukraine, along the border with Belarus, but their large-scale conversion was not until the end of the 13th century. Saint Abraham fell asleep in the Lord in the year 1222, and his feast day is August 22nd. It should be noted that for some reason unbeknownst to us, and despite living his entire life outside of the Roman Catholic Church, while never evincing any specifically papist beliefs, Pope Paul III canonized Saint Abraham as a Catholic saint in 1549. The missions to the north, evangelizing the Finno-Ugaric tribes. The territory of the Rus principalities was a relatively small area, really only a fraction of the size of European Russia. So though the conversion of the Rus was of monumental importance, it was really only the first domino in a long row that would eventually end up in America. Once the Rus were largely converted, the push began to convert the northern peoples, commonly known in the Russian sources as Chud. Chud was perhaps initially the name of a tribe, but it soon became a generic term for the Finno-Ugaric tribes who inhabited the area of the north. In fact, as can be seen on the screen, they made up the majority of the northern territory controlled by the Principality of Novgorod, as well as ruling their own kingdoms and principalities. Now, if you notice the map on the screen, the green territory is the expanse of the Finno-Ugaric people. This used to be a fairly widespread language group, but now the main languages remaining from it are Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian. In fact, even the name Moscow is originally a Finno-Ugaric name meaning black water. But they made up the entirety of the north, so that if you were to make a horizontal line about 100 miles north of the city of Moscow, and that line went from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, almost everything north of that line would have been Finno-Ugaric and pagan. Now, most of the missionary work to these northern tribes was done by the monastics, and, as mentioned earlier, it should not be thought that these tribes and federations easily gave up their paganism upon the conversion of St. Vladimir, nor should one believe that they typically accepted Christianity peacefully. Much as a Christian doing missionary work among Muslims today, it was extremely dangerous, and a disproportionately large number of these missionaries were killed in the mission field, with others experiencing beatings, being driven out, and repeated attempts on their lives. One such martyr is the Bishop of Rostov, St. Leonti, who, having to flee the city due to civil unrest, settled in the countryside nearby in Rostov-Suzdal, and started to care for the local people, a minority of whom were Slavic Christians, while most were Slavic and Finno-Ugaric pagans. These pagans eventually martyred him in 1070, but Bishop Isaiah, who succeeded the martyred Bishop Leonti, continued the missionary endeavors of his predecessor, and they eventually converted the countryside around Rostov. His memory is commemorated on May the 23rd. Similarly, in 1127, when Prince Yaroslav Sviatoslavich founded the Principality of Murom just outside Moscow, he initiated an organized effort to convert the pagans in the urban centers. In fact, when Prince Yaroslav sent his son, Mikhail, to start catechizing the pagans, they martyred Mikhail. The pagans then attempted to kill Prince Yaroslav himself, but when he appeared carrying only an icon, they suddenly changed their minds, and shortly thereafter, many accepted Christianity. On a larger scale, and more successful than Prince Yaroslav Sviatoslavich, were the efforts of Grand Duke Yaroslav II Vsevolodovich, the father of Prince St. Alexander Nevsky. He sent missions into Karelia in 1227, which brought about the first mass baptisms in the region and began a long process to convert the Finno-Ugaric tribes. Further, he continued to support these efforts until his death in 1246. Grand Duke Yaroslav II will be mentioned later on in relation to the missions to the Turkic tribes, as he was twice married to Turkic princesses who were both Christians. Though there were sporadic conversions, the movement to convert the Finno-Ugaric, also known as Chud tribes, had started in the 13th century with figures such as St. Dionysius Glushitsky, who founded the Spaso Kameni monastery and evangelized pagan Finno-Ugaric tribes in the Vologda region north of Moscow. His monastics then organized the construction of parish churches in newly converted Chud villages, and St. Dionysius often crafted the icons for his monasteries and the parishes they established. The work of evangelizing these tribes was interrupted by the Mongol invasion, and the devastation it wrought is discussed later on. But after nearly a century of stagnation, the mission to the northern tribes accelerated rapidly in the mid-14th century under the famous Russian holy man, St. Sergius of Radonezh. Famous for his exceeding humility and holiness, as well as his ability to work miracles, St. Sergius established the Holy Trinity Monastery in Moscow and was able to establish roughly 40 more monasteries across north and central Russia before reposing in 1392. These monasteries were the mission centers to the pagan tribes that surrounded them, and they further solidified the Christianity of the existing Christians. The memory of St. Sergius of Radonezh is celebrated on September 25th, and his life was written by his disciple St. Epiphanius the Wise, the same person who wrote the life of another saint we will see shortly, St. Stephen of Perm. Just as several other post-schism Orthodox saints we have and will encounter in this video, St. Sergius of Radonezh is canonized as saint by the Roman Catholic Church. One of St. Sergius's disciples, St. Abraham Galich, evangelized the area of Chukloma Lake in the Galich region of Kostroma province, which is northeast of Moscow, by founding 4 monasteries before his death in 1375, including the famous Gorodetsky Monastery, which he placed next to the capital of the local Finno-Ugaric tribe, specifically because it was the epicenter of their pagan rituals. One of the most famous missionary figures in Russian history, and a major figure in the missions of the northern tribes, is St. Stephen of Perm. Born in 1340 in the Vologda region west of the Ural Mountains, St. Stephen preferred church services and books at an early age, and learned to read Slavonic letters, followed by studying the Permian language, known as Zurian, or Komi, so that he could better evangelize the Permians, who lived in a gigantic expanse to the north and east of Rus. He also learned to read Greek for the express purpose of translating the Bible, liturgical services, and the church fathers in Syrian, but he was faced with a great obstacle. Syrian had no alphabet, so St. Stephen invented one for them, which can be seen in the image on screen. In 1379, and now a hieromonk, he traveled up the northern Dvina River, which drains directly into the Arctic Sea via Arkhangelsk. It is there, where the northern Dvina and Vychegda rivers meet, he began his missionary endeavors. Shortly thereafter, he headed down to the main pagan shrine of the Permians in Yemden. He cut down a sacred birch tree and built a church on the site. Shortly thereafter, the Archangel Michael Monastery was built there and acted as a beacon in the conversion of the Permians. St. Stephen founded 3 other monasteries for the Permians, a second one also named Archangel in Urensk, one in Spaso-Ulyanovsk, and a fourth in Stefanovsk. Furthermore, he created a network of educational centers to spread literacy in the Syrian alphabet and to continue catechizing the Permians. The entirety of the Permian people were now inside one diocese that was 500 kilometers or more in any direction from the main see of Yemden. St. Stephen served the Permians for 18 years before reposing in the Lord in 1396. St. Stephen's work can still be seen to this day, in which, despite heavy assimilation, there are more than 300,000 Permians, and they still speak their languages, and a disproportionately large number of them are Old Believers. Now, as mentioned earlier, St. Stephen's life was written by St. Epiphanius the Wise, who died in 1420 and who is commemorated on May the 23rd. You can see him on the far left in this illustration from the Vita of St. Sergius of Radonej, as this is the same St. Epiphanius who was a disciple of St. Sergius of Radonej and who also wrote St. Sergius's life. In the illustration, St. Epiphanius is writing that Vita. Now, in St. Stephen's Vita, St. Epiphanius records how St. Stephen was confronted by a local shaman and magician named Pam. Pam attempted to turn the curious Permians against St. Stephen, but St. Stephen publicly debated Pam. Seeing no end to it, it was decided that they would undergo 2 trials. First, Pam would accompany St. Stephen into a burning hut and stay in it while it burned. Pam, not surprisingly, refused. Next, they would both have to climb into the river through a hole in the ice and then, being carried by the river, come out a hole further downstream. St. Stephen, trusting in God, completed the task, but Pam refused. Infuriated at their shaman, whom they now realized was just a fraud and a poser, the Permians gave Pam to St. Stephen and encouraged him to execute Pam. Now, St. Stephen was far kinder than many who would have immediately jumped at the opportunity to publicly finish off their obnoxious and heretical opponent in a blood-drenched demonstration of victory. But St. Stephen, following the gospel of Jesus Christ's injunction, pardoned Pam and allowed him to go in peace. In 1383, St. Stephen was consecrated a bishop and installed in Perm. Impressed by St. Stephen's progress in evangelizing the Syrians, the hero of the Battle of Kulikovo Field, St. Dmitry Donskoy, funded St. Stephen's mission, richly thus allowing him to build numerous churches and furnish them with icons, bells, Eucharistic vessels, and gospel and liturgical books in the Syrian language. According to the life of St. Stephen by St. Epiphanius, quote, "With the donation of the great Prince Dmitry Ivanovich and his boyars, he constructed churches and monasteries and zealously destroyed all pagan monuments. He destroyed their hollowed-out gods, uprooted them, burned them with fire, chopped them apart with an axe, and turned them to ashes." End quote. St. Stephen reposed in the Lord in 1396. His feast day is April 27th. The immediate successor of St. Stephen of Perm was Isaac, but not much is known about him except that he stayed mostly in Moscow. Isaac's successor, however, St. Gerasim, continued the missionary work of St. Stephen and expanded it to the Vogel, also known as Mansi people. It was while ministering to the Mansi people that St. Gerasim was martyred, when an overly patriotic Vogel strangled him with his own Amaphorian in 1444, believing rumors that St. Gerasim was an agent of Moscow. His feast day is on January the 29th. St. Gerasim's successor, St. Pitram the Wonder Worker, pictured in the middle here along with his predecessor and successor, continued the missionary endeavors of his predecessors over the gigantic Perm diocese and sought to protect the Syrians from marauding tribes. He was killed by marauding Vogels after serving liturgy in 1455, and the memory of his martyrdom is celebrated on August 19th. St. Pitram was succeeded by St. Jonah, who evangelized the region known as Greater Perm, and even baptized Greater Perm's ruler. By the time of St. Jonah's death in 1472, Christianity was the majority religion among the Permians, with all of their spiritual needs being provided in Permian and largely by native Permian clergy. His memory is also celebrated on August 19th with St. Pitram. At roughly the same time that St. Stephen of Perm was beginning his missionary activities, another St. Stephen, this one St. Stephen Makrishishki, left the Kievan caves and traveled northwest past Moscow to the Vologda region, where he founded the Avnej monastery with his disciples St. Gregory and St. Cassian in 1370. The great saint was so renowned that the Prince of Moscow and Grand Prince of Vladimir, St. Dmitry Donskoy, was counted among St. Stephen's admirers and patrons. In such high esteem did St. Dmitry Donskoy hold St. Stephen that he asked Stephen to assist in the founding of another monastery, that being the Simonov Monastery in Moscow, where the bodies of the warriors killed at Kulikovo Field were buried. Kulikovo Field, it should be remembered, was the battle in which the beleaguered Rus forces, led by St. Dmitry Donskoy, who, it should be noted, was blessed to fight the Mongols by none other than St. Sergius of Radonej, smashed the Mongols in 1380 and thus shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. When St. Stephen died in 1406, his body became extremely fragrant as a sign of his holiness. The monastic establishment he began then served as a base for the illumination of the surrounding area to the Christian faith. We celebrate his memory on June 14th. With St. Stephen were his two disciples, St. Gregory and St. Cassian, who helped him found the Holy Trinity Sergius Avnej Monastery. They both worked relentlessly to convert the local pagans and strengthen the existing Christians in their faith. Both were martyred in 1392 by the Vyatchin tribe and Tartars who were pillaging the borders of Vologda. Their feast day is June 15th. Other disciples of St. Sergius of Radonej entered the Vologda region far north of Moscow and worked on the evangelization of the countryside. Most notable among them were Saints Paul and Sylvester Obnosky, who established the Pavlo-Oborsk monastery in 1414. This monastery ended up becoming a highly influential institution in the 17th century and was a beacon of Orthodox Christianity to the local Chud tribes. Yet another disciple of St. Sergius of Radonej was St. Sergius of Murom, who was a Greek by birth but traveled from Mount Athos to meet the famed St. Sergius of Radonej. St. Sergius of Murom eventually settled in the Vologda region, where he gathered about 40 monks. It was there where he built the Transfiguration Parish and, at the insistence of the aforementioned St. Paul Obnosky, he also constructed the Holy Trinity Monastery. The saint reposed in 1412, having worked tirelessly for the evangelization of the region, and he is commemorated on October 7th. Northern Russia was also blessed by the efforts of the extreme ascetic St. Dmitry Prelutsky, who established the monastery of St. Nicholas in Yaroslavl, but, with his disciple Pachomius, he traveled to the region of Vologda in search of a quiet abode. After searching far and wide, they settled on a spot near the Vologda River and established another monastery, eventually becoming known as the Spaso-Prelutsky Monastery, which was the first Cenobitic monastery in northern Russia. St. Dmitry was renowned for his charity to the poor, his clairvoyance, and, because his Lenten diet consisted of nothing other than prosphora and water, his strict ascetical life. St. Dmitry fell asleep in the Lord in 1392, and his feast day is February 11th. Another great saint operating in the Vologda region was St. Cyril Belozersky, the abbot of the Simonov Monastery in Moscow. In 1397, the Mother of God appeared to him and disclosed the location for a new monastery to be named after the Dormition along the White Lake in an area inhabited largely by pagan Finno-Ugaric tribes. When famine struck, through the prayers of St. Cyril, the resources of Dormition Monastery specifically bread, did not run out, and he was able to feed the local inhabitants, many of whom were pagan and who converted after seeing the miracle. St. Cyril died in 1427, and his memory is celebrated on June 9th. In the 14th century, the nephew of St. Sergius of Radonezh, St. Theodore of Rostov, converted the Finno-Ugaric tribes along Lake Kubinskoye in the region of Vologda. Much like St. Dionysius Glushitsky, St. Theodore of Rostov was an iconographer and crafted the icons in the monasteries and churches he founded. His memory is celebrated on both November 28th and May 23rd. Now, if we travel north of Vologda and follow the path of the northern Dvina River, we will find it drains into the Arctic Sea via the province of Arkhangelsk. The monks followed the rivers along which the majority of settlements had developed, and it was along the northern Dvina in the 12th century that the Archangel Mikhailov Kurelsky Monastery began evangelization efforts among the Finno-Ugaric tribes there. For example, St. Cyril of Chelmogorsky founded the Chelmogorsky Monastery in the city of Kargopol in modern-day Arkhangelsk province, and when he died in 1368, significant headway had been made in the conversion of the local Finno-Ugaric tribes due to St. Cyril's calm, compassionate, and gentle demeanor. His feast day is celebrated on December 8th. St. Lazar of Murom was a Greek by birth and was sent by Bishop Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia to St. Basil, Bishop of Novgorod. Known for his exceptional skill in iconography, upon arriving in Novgorod, St. Lazar copied the Sophia icon of the Mother of God and wrote a chronicle of the churches, monasteries, and shrines he found in Novgorod. When both the Bishop of Novgorod, St. Basil, and St. Basil of Caesarea reposed in the Lord, St. Lazar was grief-stricken and desired to return to his homeland, but the hierarchs appeared to him separately in dreams, ordering him to go north to Lake Onega to evangelize the tribes there. Heeding their orders, he immediately went north and settled on Lake Onega, where he was refused entry by the landowner, who only allowed him to settle due to a vision in which St. Basil of Novgorod appeared to the landowner, ordering him to allow St. Lazar to settle there. Even after that, despite being attacked, beaten, and nearly assassinated by the pagan Lapps, St. Lazar established the Dormition Monastery after being repeatedly shown the location in a vision by the Mother of God. The situation with the inhabitants was essentially fruitless, and at best volatile until, out of pure desperation, a local Lapp brought his child who had been born blind to St. Lazar, who immediately and miraculously restored the child's vision. The local Lapps, impressed by the healing and moved by the saint's mercy towards them in performing the miracle, began to convert to Christianity, and many became monastics under him. Shortly thereafter, St. Lazar was joined by other Greek monastics, namely the monks St. Eleazar, St. Eumenius, and St. Nazarius, all of whom are celebrated on June 4th, and who eventually founded the Forerunner Monastery in the region of Olonetsk. Before his death at age 105, St. Lazar built the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos Church, which was the first along that coast. He also built two other churches, one dedicated to the resurrection of St. Lazarus, and another to St. John the Honorable Forerunner and Baptist. He reposed in the Lord in 1391, and his feast day is March 8th. Shortly after St. Lazar of Murom, in 1429, the ascetic St. Savati arrived at Solovetsky Island on the Arctic Sea and was soon joined by the monks St. Zosimos and Herman, who founded Solovetsky Monastery in 1436. From the monastery, the monks began to evangelize the pagan Finno-Ugaric tribes such as the Izora, the Merman, the Lopya, and the Kayane peoples. In 1453, St. Savati died, but his disciple, St. Zosima, managed to make a major headway in converting the local pagans by the time of his death in 1478. St. Savati's memory is commemorated on September the 27th. Turning our gaze west from Arkhangelsk, we encounter the region of Karelia and its famous Valam monastery. It is not clear exactly when Valam was established, but the scholarly consensus is that it was in the late 14th century, which makes sense as Valam was part of a much larger push to convert the surrounding Karelians, who are another Finno-Ugaric people, to Orthodox Christianity. It was for this expressed purpose that St. Arseny of Konevsky established the Konevsky Nativity Monastery on Konovets Island in Lake Ladoga in 1393. St. Arsene's missionary work amongst the pagan peoples there was exceptionally successful despite having to deal with the monastery's island property repeatedly flooding. St. Arsene even brought a miraculous icon of the Mother of God from Mount Athos, which portrays the Christ child playing with a dove. It should be noted that the Konovets monastery is considered the younger twin of Valam, as both of them are on Lake Ladoga in Karelia, and both were founded with the primary purpose of evangelizing the local Finno-Ugaric tribes. His feast day is June 12th. Similarly, in 1410, St. Euphemius came to Karelia with several disciples and built the St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker monastery outside Arkhangelsk. For years they labored among the pagans with little success, and finally, in 1419, Norwegians attacked the monastery, killing some of the monks and setting fire to the complex. St. Euphemius was determined to rebuild, and a wealthy noblewoman whose two sons were buried at the monastery donated a large sum of money to cover the cost of construction. After this, the missionary work began to bear tremendous fruit, and for this, St. Euphemius is known as the enlightener of Karelia and Finland. His disciples, St. Stephen the ascetic, Isaiah, and Nicanor, continued his work in the conversion of the Lapps. St. Euphemius's feast day is April 18th. In 1533, a monk from Novgorod named St. Tryphon traveled to Pechenga, which is located at what is currently the very northern border between Russia and Finland, and continued the work of evangelizing the Lapps. At first, the Lapps were uninterested and at times violent, but St. Tryphon's meekness and humility won them over. Furthermore, he made sure to have a thorough understanding of their religious beliefs and customs, which helped him tremendously while evangelizing them. St. Tryphon built the Church of the Holy Trinity, and later, nearby, he built the Church of St. Boris and Gleb. Tsar Ivan the Terrible donated bells, Eucharistic vessels and utensils, and vestments to the monastery. For his work among the Lapps, he is known as St. Tryphon, enlightener of the Sami. Having worked tirelessly for the conversion of the Lapps along the Pechenga River, St. Tryphon reposed in the Lord in 1583, and his feast day is December 15th. As a side note, St. Tryphon of Pechenga's intercessions are often sought by sailors who are in danger. A figure whom we will discuss more later when we cover the conversion of the Turkic peoples, but who is important in the conversion of the northern tribes, is St. Macarius of Novgorod, who was later Metropolitan of all Russia. Though he is now most well known for his 12-volume Great Menayan containing the lives of Russian saints, the great Archbishop of Novgorod and later Metropolitan of all Russia, St. Macarius was instrumental in the conversion of untold numbers of pagans and Muslims to Orthodox Christianity, and it is to this towering figure, whose memory we celebrate on December 30th, that we now turn. The work of the monastics and hermits had sown deep roots, and word of the miracles they worked, the kindness they displayed, as well as their humility and charity, spread far and wide, so that many pagan tribes in the north began to send requests to St. Macarius of Novgorod for missionaries to be sent to them. One such group, the Lapps from Kondylskaya Bay on the White Sea, requested missionaries in 1526, while another group of Lapps, these from the Anoia River, also requested missionaries. When Tsar Ivan the Terrible heard this, he ordered the Church of Saints Peter and Paul to be built for them, and he supplied them with liturgical books, vestments, Eucharistic vessels and utensils, bells, and icons. St. Macarius ordained a priest and deacon for them, and raised funds to have the Church of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist built as their second church. Shortly thereafter, in 1532, other tribes of Lapps from the Murmansk Sea and the Kola and Tutolma rivers also asked for missionaries from St. Macarius. When a priest and deacon were sent to them, they converted willingly. In fact, the Lapps who resided at the Kola and Tutolma rivers were enlightened by St. Theodoratus, often called the enlightener of the Lapps. He preached along the Kola River for 20 years, attaining fluency in the Lapp language, inventing an alphabet for them, translating liturgical books, and catechizing them. Initially, though, it was hard and thankless work. For example, he worked among them for 7 years before he was able to build the Church of St. John the Baptist at the mouth of the Niva River. But eventually, after attaining greater success in his missionary endeavors, he traveled to Novgorod and asked assistance from Archbishop St. Macarius, who sent St. Theodoratus back to the Kola River with teams of builders and liturgical supplies. From there, he had two parishes built, Annunciation Church and St. Nicholas Church, which are in what is now the modern city of Kola. Due to the saint's fluency in Greek, he was sent on an emissary mission to Constantinople, and in the image on screen, he is seen in the left accepting gifts from Tsar Ivan the Terrible. He reposed in the Lord in 1571, and his memory is commemorated on August 17th. The missionaries were not always evangelizing pagans, but oftentimes Christians who had failed to completely leave their paganism behind. For example, between the Baltic Sea and Lake Ladoga reside various Finno-Ugaric tribes such as the Izora and the Koriel tribes, both of which have now been almost completely assimilated into Russian society. They had adopted Christianity starting in the 13th century, but continued consulting shamans, sacrificing animals, and keeping sacred trees and stones. When the Archbishop of Novgorod, St. Macarius, heard about this, he sent the hieromonk Elias in 1534 to catechize these groups and eradicate local pagan customs. So convincing was Elias that the local tribes destroyed their own pagan idols and sacred trees. When St. Macarius was elevated to Metropolitan of Moscow in 1542, his successor in Novgorod, Archbishop Theodosius II, continued his work, and by the time he died in 1551, paganism had been effectively eradicated north of Novgorod, with the exception of some of the nomadic tribes. Another saint of this time is St. Tryphon of Vyatka. He was an abbot who evangelized the Khanty, Ket, and Selkup peoples, all of whom were small nomadic groups in the Diocese of Perm. He famously cut down and then burned a tree that was sacred to the pagans before founding a monastery dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God on the Chusova River in northern Russia. In 1580, he then founded a second monastery also dedicated to the Dormition of the Mother of God in the Diocese of Vyatka, not far from Perm. St. Tryphon was known for his strict asceticism, as he always wore a hair shirt and heavy chains. He reposed in the Lord in 1612, and his memory is celebrated on October 12th. Finally, St. Mazael of Aglomazovo, Archbishop of Ryazan, is called the Apostle to the Mordovians, which were another Finno-Ugaric group. He also did some limited missionary work amongst the Tatars in the area, but was martyred in 1655 by a disgruntled pagan Mordovian who shot him with an arrow. The saint died 9 days later, shortly after Pascha. In addition to the saint's missionary work, he was known for the strictness of life, starting a crusade against laxity amongst the clergy and against drunkenness in the general population. St. Mazael's incorrupt relics are at the Holy Trinity Monastery in Ryazan, and we celebrate his memory on April 10th. In the 12th century, had you drawn a horizontal line across what is now Russia, about 100 miles north of Moscow, almost everyone above that line would have been a Finno-Ugaric pagan. After centuries of missionary work by monastics who knew they would be attacked and beaten, who knew their monasteries would be plundered and burned, who knew they would see their fellow monastics martyred, and who ultimately knew they would very likely be martyred themselves, all of northern Russia had become Christian by the early 17th century, and paganism had been completely eradicated from northern Finland to the Urals. For example, by the year 1600, in Karelia, Karelian Pomoria, and the Kola Peninsula, there were 200 Orthodox schools and so many churches that for every 500 people, there was an Orthodox parish where services were performed regularly, and these statistics represent simply the most newly converted area within the Russian Empire. Orthodox missionaries had managed to convert a gigantic area roughly the size of Western Europe, that is Russia west of the Ural Mountains. This was not due to government mandates or conversion by the sword. The monastics were not backed by conquistadors, nor did they have to slave drive indigenous people to mass using whips like the Spanish friars regularly did. No, this was done simply because these monks were willing to be martyrs, because they worked miracles, because they translated services into the local native languages, and above all, because they were committed to following Christ's injunction to go and make disciples of all nations. When we began this section, it was stated that even in a place as Christianized as Novgorod in the year 1100, the total Christian population of the city would have amounted to no more than 1/3 to 1/2 of the city. Cities closer to the Urals would have had even less, perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of their inhabitants as Christians. In other words, the vast majority of the conversion of European Russia was completed in the 500 years after the Great Schism. Despite this great success, we have not yet covered the missions in the Baltic states or to the Russian steppe, and in this next half available to our Patreon subscribers, we will cover in detail how the missionaries converted the pagan tribes to their west in the midst of Catholic invasions as well, and how the missionaries went south to convert gigantic swathes of pagans, Muslims, and Nestorian Turkic tribes, making most of what is now Russia Orthodox Christian. The missions to the Baltic nations. The Gustin Chronicle records that in 1246 AD, the ruler of Lithuania, Mindaugas, and many of his soldiers were baptized. And though Mindaugas was most likely baptized as a Roman Catholic, several of his relatives decided instead to be received into the Orthodox Church. During his reign, Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity, made significant inroads. Mindaugas' son, Vaishvilkas, had converted to Orthodox Christianity and founded the Lavrashev monastery on the Niemen River, to which he retired, but when his father was murdered by his nephew in 1263, Vaishvilkas came out of retirement and overthrew the usurper, thus becoming Grand Duke of Lithuania. During his short reign, Vaishvilkas invited Orthodox priests from Novgorod and Pskov, fluent in Lithuanian, and they began the task of evangelization. Within a few years, he desired to return to monastic life and resumed life in his monastery, where he was unfortunately murdered due to resentment over whom he had left power to. Another one of Mindaugas' relatives, Saint Charitina, became a nun and later was elevated to the role of abbess of the convents of St. Peter and Paul. She reposed in the Lord in 1281, and her feast day is October 5th. After Vaishvilkas' reign, the next 9 Grand Dukes of Lithuania were avowed pagans. Some of them were married to Christian women in order to forge alliances, and many had children who had adopted Christianity. But the kings were anywhere from occasionally hostile to Christianity all the way to being completely indifferent to it. Despite that, several wooden churches existed in Vilnius, but in 1330, a stone church dedicated to the martyr St. Paraskiva was also built in Vilnius. 19 years later, in 1349, a second stone church, this time named Holy Trinity, was also built in Vilnius. The following year, in 1350, a third stone church was built and was dedicated to St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker, making for several wooden churches and 3 stone churches in the city of Vilnius. Furthermore, there were 11 Orthodox monasteries in Lithuania, such as Holy Trinity and Nativity monasteries in Vilnius, Lavrash near Novgorodok, Nativity of the Theotokos in Trakai, and Saints Boris and Gleb in Grodno. Among the most famous saints of Lithuania, and ones who were martyred for spreading Christianity, are the holy martyrs Saints Anthony, John, and Eustathius, who suffered martyrdom in 1347. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, the very powerful and wily Algirdas, had made a token conversion to Christianity in order to marry the Russian princess Maria of Vitebsk. Now, Algirdas had allowed a Christian retinue to come with her from Russia, and even allowed Christians to build 4 Orthodox churches in Vilnius, so long as they did not proselytize the local pagans. But when his wife Maria died, Algirdas threw off any pretensions of Christianity. When he heard that Anthony, John, and Eustathius were evangelizing the pagans, Algirdas ordered them to stop, and then demanded they eat meat on a fast day. When they refused, on both counts, Algirdas subjected them to horrendous and prolonged tortures before killing them. Their feast day is celebrated on April 14th, and, as can be seen on the screen, their incorrupt relics are kept behind glass at the Orthodox Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Vilnius, Lithuania. As a side note, for reasons completely unknown to us, they were canonized in the Roman Catholic Church in 1969 by Pope Paul VI, actually a semi-common phenomenon that Eastern European saints post-schism, such as St. Abraham of Smolensk, St. Seraphim of Sorov, St. Sergius of Radonej, the aforementioned holy martyrs Saints Anthony, John, and Eustathius, and many others, were canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. not one of the Eastern Catholic churches, but by the Roman Catholic Church itself. Now, Orthodox Christianity was growing steadily in the Baltic region, and Algirdas's oldest son converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Andrei, and he became prince of Polotsk and Pskov. But when Algirdas's son Jogaila, who was a pagan, came to power in 1377, his mother Uliana of Tver attempted to arrange a marriage between him and Sophia, who was the daughter of Saint Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow. This would have required Jogaila to convert to Orthodox Christianity, but Jogaila was eager to fend off the attacks of the Teutonic Knights who had been attacking Lithuania for the better part of the last century, and realized that were he to convert to Orthodox Christianity, he would still be the target of crusades by the Catholic Teutonic Knights. Because of this, Jogaila made the practical move of opting for Catholicism over Orthodox Christianity, and thereby pacified the Teutonic Knights. Furthermore, by converting to Catholicism, he was eligible to marry the Polish queen Jadwiga, thereby joining the Lithuanian and Polish crowns into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth through the Union of Kreva in 1385 AD. This demanded not only his conversion to Catholicism, but enforcement of Catholicism within his realm. This was the beginning of the decline of Orthodoxy in the Baltic, and it started a series of events over the next century and a half that would lead to the forced conversion of much of the pagans and Orthodox Christians to Catholicism, leaving only a remnant of Orthodox Christians who were largely impoverished and disenfranchised because of their religious convictions. Many people near the borders simply picked up and moved into the realm of Russia, where they knew their religion would be tolerated. But as can be seen in the map on screen, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was gigantic and covered present-day Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia and Estonia. In fact, with such massive holdings, it is a miracle that Orthodox Christianity survived at all in this region, but much of that story has to be saved for the next video. The missions to the Turkic nations. The fifth area of missionary work which the Orthodox Church engaged in between 1054 and 1600 was the conversion of the Turkic tribes. Now, the primary tribes were the Cumans, the Kipchaks, the Pechenegs, Oghuz, Turks, and the Volga Bulgars. It should be noted that we are not covering the conversion of the Khazars, as they had already largely been assimilated into the surrounding peoples prior to the time frame we are covering, due to Sviatoslav I of Kiev's having conquered them in the mid-10th century. The Pechenegs were a Turkic group, residing in what is now southern Russia, but, along with the Oghuz Turks, they were gradually pushed into what is now western Ukraine in the 11th century, with the arrival of the gigantic Kuman-Kipchak Confederation, which lasted from the mid-900s until 1241 when the Mongols conquered it. At its height, the Kuman-Kipchak Confederation reached from the Danube all the way across the Russian steppe into Kazakhstan, but despite their fame, the origins of both the Kuman and the Kipchak are highly obscure, and it is postulated that they originated near the Altai Mountains, at the junction between Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. In the Slavic sources, the Kuman Kipchaks are referred to as Podlavtsi, and everyone who writes about them comments that the Kuman Kipchaks are blonde and light-skinned, oftentimes having colorful eyes. This becomes important later on because it explains why little trace of them is left as they assimilated into Rus and Balkan populations so rapidly. There were also the Volga Bulgars. They had converted to Islam in 922, and it was to them that St. Vladimir of Kiev had sent an emissary to investigate the suitability of Islam for the Rus in the famous story of his conversion to Orthodox Christianity. Like the Kuman-Kipchak alliance, the Volga-Bulgar state also collapsed during the initial Mongol onslaught from 1237 to 1242. Emperor Alexios Komnenos I settled a large number of Pechenegs in modern-day Macedonia, and in 1091, after defeating them with his combined Byzantine Kuman force at the Battle of Levo-Union. We hear very little about the Pechenegs after this, save for military detachments of them at various points up until the mid-12th century, because by that time, they had simply assimilated into the surrounding Slavic culture and adopted Orthodox Christianity. Something similar occurred with the Karamanlids. They were Turkish mercenaries who served under the Komnenes in the late 11th and throughout the 12th century. In exchange for military service, they were given land in Anatolia and converted to Orthodox Christianity from Islam. What stands out about them is despite the fact they continued to speak their dialect of Turkish, they wrote it using the Greek alphabet. Even in the liturgy in their parishes and in their published prayer books, they used their dialect of Turkish, but written in Greek letters, as you can see with the inscription on screen, which is from a now abandoned church outside of Konya in central Turkey. The Karamanlids were fairly numerous, with 200,000 of them, which constituted almost the entirety of their community, deported to Greece from Turkey during the 1923 population exchange. Based on their poetry and how they acted during the war, most of them did not want to leave, but preferred to stay in Cappadocia in Turkey, where they knew the language and culture. Unlike other Greeks who had a sense of good riddance, the Karamanlids saw it as irredeemably catastrophic for their culture, and this has proven true as hardly any of their descendants speak the language or know much of anything about the culture. It should be noted that there are two theories on the origins of the Karamanlids. The one just presented to you, and then the counter theory to which it is as follows. The Karamanlids were Greek Christians who adopted Turkish language and then slowly lost their ability to speak the Greek language while retaining their Christian religion. This theory is a minority view, and it fails because the same supposed phenomenon happened nowhere else, which would make the Karamanlids a complete anomaly among the Christian populations of Anatolia, whether Greek, Armenian, Syriac, or Assyrian. Even in the case of Arabicized Christians, it was a uniform Arabization, not simply a single pocket in a single region like the supposed case of the Karamanlids. Even when speaking about something like the Urum Turks, the ethnic group still considers itself Greek despite speaking Urum. The majority view follows what was a common occurrence: Turkic tribes converting to Orthodox Christianity and using the local alphabet to write their own languages. That was, as we will continue to see, ubiquitous. Next, moving on to Georgia, King David IV, known as King David the Builder, married the Kuman princess Garandukt in 1107 AD, forging an alliance between the Kingdom of Georgia and the Kuman Kipchak Confederation. 11 years later, in 1118, King David reached an agreement with his Kipchak father-in-law, Khan Otrak, that the Khan and his 40,000 followers would be baptized and provide military service to Georgia against the Seljuk Turks, in exchange for being able to settle in Georgia. These Kipchaks eventually assimilated, though some later on went back to the steppe, when their battlefield nemesis, the Rus prince Monomakh, died in 1125. The Kumans who stayed and were Christianized became known as Nakivchakari in Georgian, or De-Kipchakt, and many of them reached high positions in the Georgian royal court. Furthermore, tens of thousands more Kumans were settled in Georgia in the late 1140s and late 1180s, and were incorporated into the military. As mentioned earlier, the Volga Bulgars converted to Islam in 922, and they alternated between trade partners and fierce rivals of the Rus principalities. But Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky, the Prince of Vladimir, Suzdal, and Rostov, known as Saint Andrei the Pious after canonization, or, in Western sources, as the Scythian Caesar, organized missionary work towards the Bulgars with some success. His mother was a Kuman princess and daughter of a Yepa Khan. During his reign, he had 30 churches built within his realm, and whenever Jews, Muslims, pagans, or Roman Catholics visited his realm, it was law that they first be taken to see the closest church St. Andrei had built. Just as the emissaries of St. Vladimir of Kiev were stunned and inspired by the liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, troves of heterodox, Bulgar Turks, Jews, and pagans were inspired to convert. St. Andrei was killed in 1174, and his memory is celebrated on June the 30th. It should be noted that St. Andrei's son, Yuri, fled for his life to the Kipchaks when his father was murdered, and then went on to be the first husband of Queen Tamar of Georgia. But the most famous Volga Bulgar Orthodox Christian, and one who came nearly 50 years after St. Andrei, is Saint Abraham the Bulgarian. Saint Abraham was a Muslim merchant who converted to Orthodox Christianity and was martyred in 1229 when he returned to his own people to convert them. We commemorate his martyrdom on April 1st, and the translation of his relics on March 9th. Further examples of the Christianization of Turkic tribes is in the marriage of Prince Mstislav Mstislavich the Daring. His wife, baptized with the name Maria, was a Kipchak princess whose father was Kipchak Khan Kutin. Likewise, the father of Saint Alexander Nevsky, Yaroslav II, was married to the daughter of the Kuman Khan Yuri Konchakovich. Notice the Kuman Khan had a Christian name, Yuri or George. When his first wife died, Yaroslav II married another Kuman, Rotislava, the daughter of Mstislav the Daring, and his Kipchak wife, Maria, in 1214. Yaroslav II and Rotislava eventually separated, and Yaroslav II married a third time, and it was from his third marriage with a Slav that he sired Saint Alexander Nevsky. Large numbers of Kumans and Kipchaks even found their way into the Balkans via service as mercenaries or in fleeing the Mongol advance. In fact, so many Kumans and Kipchaks eventually settled in the Balkans that they founded the Wallachian royal line known as the Basarabids, as well as 3 Bulgarian royal dynasties in a row, the Asanids, the Terturids, and the Shishmanids, spanning from 1185 through 1422, when they were eventually conquered by the Ottomans. There were also numerous Kuman Kipchak Khans who were baptized, such as Khan Amarat, who was baptized in Ryazan in 1132. Khan Aida was baptized in Kiev in 1168, and Khan Bastia was baptized in 1223. Famous Kuman Kipchaks, such as the Khan Danilo Kobiakovich and Khan Yuri Konchakovich, both of whom were slain in battle against the Mongols, have the very noticeable Christian names Daniel and George, respectively, in Slavic form, indicating they were Christian Kumans. Though not a Turkic group, Circassians do, or rather did, reside in an area that was largely Turkic, and the Georgian Orthodox Church worked extensively to convert them starting in 1184 with the ascent of Queen Tamar, all the way to 1424 when the Georgians lost the territory. As can be seen in the map on screen, the Georgians had a sizable empire consisting of both direct territory and vassal states in 1230, the Circassians being part of that vassalage. Queen Tamar is a saint of the Church, and her feast day is May the 1st, but the Antiochian Church celebrates it on April 22nd. During this time period, the Georgians, along with their Alan allies, began a fairly intensive effort to convert the Vaynaq peoples, who are the ancestors of the modern-day Chechens and Ingush peoples. Those regions were actually Orthodox Christian up until the 17th century, and there is still a sizable minority of Orthodox Chechens, and some Muslim Chechens occasionally convert. The Mongol yoke. Now, it was at about this point that another Turkish group, the Mongols, appeared on the scene in what is now Russia, and their advent permanently and drastically changed the course of Rus history. Not only did it indirectly cause the decline of Kiev and emergence of Moscow as the center of Rus culture, but also in that the trauma caused by the Mongol invasion in terms of lives lost, economies wrecked, and cities destroyed, meant that time, effort, and resources, which would have gone into spreading the gospel, were now being redirected towards simply surviving. So on that note, it is worth briefly covering just how traumatic the Mongol invasion was. In 1223 AD, the Mongols made their first appearance in the land of the Rus at the Battle of Kalka River. Despite being a decisive Mongol victory, the Mongols withdrew and were not seen again until 1236, when they returned to overwhelm the Volga Bulgars, the Kipchak-Kuman Confederation, and the Alans. In 1237, when Batu and Subutai Khan invaded Rus demanding submission and that renegade Kipchaks be handed over, the Rus refused, and the Mongols wrought such devastation that one would imagine the stories are purely invented were it not for the archaeological evidence supporting them. The Mongols first destroyed the Principality of Ryazan in 1237, then Kozelsk, Kolomna, Moscow, and Vladimir Suzdal in 1238. This was followed by Pereyaslav and Chernigov in 1239. In 1240, they destroyed the former capital of the Rus, the city of Kiev. In addition, they destroyed the major cities of Yurev, Dimitrov, Volok, Tver, Torshak, and Kolomna. By 1242, all of the Rus principalities were subject and paying tribute to the Mongols, who, in those 5 years, killed an estimated 6 to 7% of the entire Rus population. At each city they destroyed, they massacred the inhabitants indiscriminately, leaving few, if any, to be enslaved. Only Novgorod and Pskov were not destroyed due to preemptively surrendering to the Mongols. So complete was the destruction that for the year 1238 AD, the Chronicle of Novgorod records, quote, "That same year, foreigners called Tatars came in countless numbers, like locusts, into the land of Ryazan, and on first coming, they halted at the river Nukla, and took it, and halted in camp there. And then the pagan foreigners surrounded Ryazan, and fenced it in with a stockade. And the Tatars took the town on December 21st, and they had advanced against it on the 16th of the same month. They likewise killed the prince and Kniginya, and men, women, and children, monks, nuns, and priests, some by fire, some by the sword, and they violated nuns, priests' wives, good women, and girls in the presence of their mothers and sisters. And who, brethren, would not lament over this among those of us left alive when they suffered this bitter and violent death? And we, indeed, having seen it, were terrified and wept with sighing day and night over our sins, while we sigh every day and night, taking thought for our possessions and for the hatred of brothers." End quote. For the same year, the chronicles record, quote, "The pagan and godless Tatars then, having taken Ryazan, went to Volodymyr, a host of shedders of Christian blood. And the lawless Ishmaelites approached the town and surrounded the town in force, and fenced it all around with a fence. And when the lawless ones had already come near and set up battering rams, and took the town and fired it on Friday before Sexagisma Sunday, the prince and Kniginya and archbishop, seeing that the town was on fire and that the people were already perishing, some by fire and others by sword, took refuge in the church of the Holy Mother of God and shut themselves in the sacristy. The pagans, breaking down the doors, piled up wood and set fire to the sacred church, and slew all. Thus they perished, giving up their souls to God. And the accursed ones, having come thence, took Moscow, Pereyaslav, Yurev, Dimitrov, Volok, and Tver. There also they killed the son of Yaroslav. And thence the lawless ones came and invested Torshak on the festival of the first Sunday in Lent. They fenced it all around with a fence, as they had taken other towns, and here the accursed ones fought with battering rams for 2 weeks. And so the pagans took the town, and slew all from the male sex, even to the female, all the priests and the monks, and all stripped and reviled, gave up their souls to the Lord in a bitter and wretched death on March 5th, the day of the commemoration of the holy martyr Nikon, on Wednesday in Easter week. And the accursed godless ones then pushed on from Torshak, by the road of Serigeri, right up to Ignati's cross, cutting down everybody like grass, to within 166 miles of Novgorod." End quote. For example, when Kiev was taken in December of 1240, the Mongols slaughtered 96% of the city's 50,000 inhabitants. The level of destruction is even backed up by the Franciscan monk Giovanni de Plano Carpini. He was sent as papal legate to the Mongol court, and in 1246 he passed through what remained of Kiev, and passed through it again on his return in 1247. He states, quote, "The Mongols attacked Russia, where they made great havoc, destroying cities and fortresses and slaughtering men. And they laid siege to Kiev, the capital of Russia. After they had besieged the city for a long time, they took it and put the inhabitants to death. When we were journeying through that land, we came across countless skulls and bones of dead men lying around on the ground. Kiev had been a very large and thickly populated town, but now it has been reduced almost to nothing, for there are at the present time scarce 200 houses there, and the inhabitants are kept in complete slavery." Going on from there, fighting as they went, the Tatars destroyed the whole of Russia. When the inhabitants of Kiev became aware of our arrival, they all came to meet us rejoicing, and they congratulated us as if we were risen from the dead." End quote. During the 5 years of Batu's invasion, from 1237 to 1242, the Mongols destroyed hundreds of cities. To put this in perspective, this would be akin to the complete destruction of New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, Philadelphia, San Antonio, and Washington, D.C., and the slaughter of all 23 million lives in said cities, which is roughly 7% of the U.S. population. For the European audience, during the Second World War, Germany lost less than 9% of its population, while the Netherlands lost 2.5%, France lost 2%, and Belgium lost around 1%, while the United Kingdom and Italy each lost less than 1% of their total population. Yet, the Second World War was unimaginably destructive, not just on the level of human lives lost, but in terms of material and financial destruction, that without foreign aid aimed at rebuilding Europe's infrastructure, it is doubtful if Europe could have recovered within the century. Yet there was no foreign aid and investment coming to the Rus principalities, and on top of it all, the Rus states then had to pay hefty tribute to the Mongols, while contributing military detachments to the Mongol armies in their campaigns. Any principality that rejected this would be laid to waste. Once all of Russia had been either destroyed and or placed under the heavy hand of the Mongols, a colossal slave trade emerged in which the Mongols depopulated the region south of Moscow all the way down to the Crimea due to their relentless slaving in order to supply the demand of the Ottoman Empire's slave markets. The Mongols not only destroyed cities and slaved, but levied heavy taxes on the rulers of the Rus principalities who had been installed for exorbitant fees while regularly going to war with said principalities. This is the main reason the evangelization of modern-day Russia took so long. Now, we had mentioned the Battle of Kalka River in 1223 AD, and how a large force of Rus and Kuman Kipchaks had been defeated by the Mongols, but one of the side effects of this battle, and the Mongol invasion as a whole, was it pushed the Turkic tribes further to the west and to the south. One example of this is a force of around 10,000 Kumans entered Thrace and started attacking towns belonging to the Nicaean Empire. But by 1242, Byzantine Emperor Dukas Vatatzes managed to settle all of them in southwest Anatolia along the Meander River in exchange for their military service and adoption of Christianity. One of the descendants of this group was Sergianes, who was a major figure in the reigns of both Byzantine emperors Andronicus II and Andronicus III in the early 14th century, serving in various capacities such as a military governor in the Balkans, a governor of Thessalonica, and still later the head of the military or Megas Dukas. There is also St. Alexander Nevsky, who, though he is best known for twice defeating Catholic invasions of the Rus lands, was also involved in missionary work in that he established 3 dioceses, Kolmskaya, Tverskaya, and Saray, the last of which was the capital of the Mongol horde. In order to open the Diocese of Saray, St. Alexander interceded on behalf of Metropolitan St. Cyril II of Kiev to the Mongol Khan and installed St. Mitrofan as its first bishop. The exceptional amount of pull this required cannot be understated, because 5 years earlier, Khan Burka had made what was at least a nominal conversion to Islam. Reasons why he allowed it to occur are manifold, but a likely reason was there were a large number of Nestorian Christians in Mongol society, and in the societies of the steppe people they ruled. Being that Khan Burka's rival, the Ilkhan, which had been founded by the infamous Hulagu Khan, favored Nestorianism, it appears as though Khan Burka was attempting to surreptitiously promote his Christian subjects toward a Christianity less cozy with his political rivals. Regardless, the Diocese of Saray embarked on such successful missionary work that Khan Burka's nephew, Khan Sartak, converted to Orthodox Christianity, doubtlessly due to the influence of his close friend and confidant, St. Alexander Nevsky, with whom he had sworn a blood oath to protect and defend one another. Sartak unfortunately ruled the Golden Horde for only 1 year before his death in 1257. Another example of the success of the Saray Diocese is Khan Mengu Temir, who was convinced to allow his daughter, later known as Anna, to be baptized and marry Saint Theodore the Black in the year 1260. Furthermore, the successor to Saint Mitrofan of Saray, Bishop Theognost, felt it necessary to write to Constantinople requesting official confirmation on how to receive pagan Tatars, Muslims, Nestorians, and Monophysites who sought to join the Orthodox Church. The issue was whether or not baptizing pagan Tatars and Muslims by pouring water on them instead of baptism by immersion was acceptable, as water on the Asian steppe was in such short supply that baptism by immersion was often not possible. We know about this request because the reply came from the Constantinople Synod of 1276, headed by none other than the infamous Patriarch John Bekos, the year before Bekos apostatized to Catholicism. The diocese at Saray became so famous amongst the Mongol elite that in 1357, the Khan Jani Beg ordered the Metropolitan of Kiev, Alexius the Wonderworker, to come to Saray to cure his mother, Taidula Khatun, by restoring her sight. When St. Alexius restored her sight, Taidula granted the Orthodox Church a plot of land and provided the great saint with a new sakos, which is a type of vestment worn by Orthodox bishops, and a precious stone set in a ring. The relics of St. Alexius, it should be noted, are incorrupt. Many years prior, in 1253, the same St. Cyril II of Kiev was summoned by the Mongols to their capital of Saray in the Golden Horde to heal the son of the Khan Burka, who was a Muslim. St. Cyril brought with him holy water from the shrine of St. Leonti of Rostov, and after sprinkling the child with it and praying for him, the child was healed. The Khan was so grateful that he ordered the tribute, which the principalities of Rostov and Yaroslavl paid to the Mongols, to instead be paid to the Cathedral of the Dormition in Rostov. St. Cyril II of Kiev is commemorated on November 21st. We also have St. Peter Tsarevich, who was the nephew of a Mongol Khan. When he witnessed the miracle performed by St. Cyril II of Rostov, using holy water from the shrine of St. Leonti of Rostov, he became intrigued by Christianity. He later moved to Rostov, and there, in 1261, was baptized and became instrumental in constructing the Church of Saints Peter and Paul in Rostov, which later became the Petrovsky Monastery on the field. The story goes that Saints Peter and Paul appeared to him in a dream with bags of gold and silver, ordering him to purchase various icons and then present them to the local bishop, which corroborated with the bishop's dream in which he was instructed to build the same church in the same spot. St. Peter married a Tatar woman with whom he had a large family, and upon her death, he took monastic vows in the Petrovsky Monastery on the field, and reposed in the Lord in 1290. His feast day is celebrated on May 23rd. By 1476, Tsar Ivan III felt strong enough to stop paying tribute to the Mongols. Previously, when Rus cities did this, their destruction quickly followed. When Novgorod stopped paying tribute in the 13th century, St. Alexander Nevsky led an army to Novgorod and captured the city, forcing it to pay tribute to the Mongols, knowing it would only be spared if they did. The Mongols had been weakened by generations of dynastic struggles and infighting, and they now found themselves in the same situation in 1480 that the Rus principalities had been in when Batu invaded in 1237. The final showdown was at the Ugra River in 1480, when Tsar Ivan III and Ahmed Khan amassed their forces, and from May to early November 1480 attempted to outmaneuver one another. Ahmed Khan was waiting for the river to freeze so his cavalry could cross, while Tsar Ivan knew the longer he stalled, the more reinforcements would arrive, and that his troops, who were equipped with firearms, could decimate the Mongol force if they crossed the frozen river. Finally, in November, Ahmed Khan simply packed up and left. That event is what is commemorated in the Feast of the Mother of God of Vladimir, thanksgiving that the city of Moscow was protected from the Muslims. The Mongols were gone, and within 75 years, the Russians would be on the military offensive towards the Tatars, but rather than massacre them, the Russians sent missionaries to evangelize them. And this is where St. Macarius of Novgorod once again enters the picture, because the crown jewel in his missionary work was not organizing missions to the Lapps in northern Russia, though that was very important, but it was the establishment of the Archdiocese of Kazan under its first bishop, St. Girius, whose memory is celebrated on December 5th. Once he was elevated to the position of metropolitan of all Russia, St. Macarius encouraged Tsar Ivan the Terrible to capture the cities of Astrakhan and Kazan, which would both put an end to the continued attacks on Russia by the Muslim Tatars and would also allow Russia to expand further east to new mission fields. He encouraged this because he believed the spread of orthodoxy to the Turkic tribes, collectively known as Tatars, and to Siberia was worthwhile and would not be accomplished as long as Islamic rule was present. As soon as the Russian military captured the area in 1552, missionary work commenced, and a massive influx of converts from Islam began. Two very famous martyrs from Kazan, both of whom were Turkic and converted from Islam, were St. Stephen of Kazan and St. Peter of Kazan, both of whom were martyred in 1555 and whose memories are celebrated March 24th. They were both killed by the local Muslims for refusing to return to Islam. Other Muslim Tatar converts in the mid to late 16th century were the nobleman Utmesh Garay of Kazan, as well as Simeon Bekbulatovich, who had been the Khan of Kazim, but later converted to Orthodoxy and ruled in Ivan the Terrible's stead for 1 year while the ruler took a sabbatical. Against those critics who would say that Simeon's conversion was purely political, he voluntarily spent the last 10 years of his life as a monk before dying in 1616. The last Khan of Kazan, Khan Yadigar Muhammad, was another convert to Orthodox Christianity. An image of his wedding is on screen right now. After his first wife died, Ivan the Terrible took the Circassian Muslim woman Kochane bint Taimur as his wife. Upon baptism, she was named Maria. The nobleman Chertas Gavirovich and his close relative, the Princess Ilyaksha, were two other Muslim Turkic converts. Princess Ilyaksha took the baptismal name Juliana and married the boyar Zachariah Ivanovich Plestyev. She was instrumental in Tursus's conversion, and when he converted, he took the name Sergius and shortly thereafter entered a monastery where he took the name Serapion. Eventually settling on Lake Kozya as a hermit in what is now northern Russia, he lived a life of extreme asceticism and established the monastery of Kozya Zero. He also built the churches of St. Nicholas and Holy Theophany in the vicinity and died in 1611. His life was written by his disciple Bogolep in 1613, and his feast day is June 27th. Likewise, the missionary work of the Orthodox Church brought in the very large Sibirsky family in 1591. They were Tatars and direct descendants of Genghis Khan, who, decades after their conversion, were eventually formally incorporated into the Russian nobility, which was no small feat. Many saints were from a Tatar lineage, such as Saint Paphnutius, the abbot of Borov, who died in 1477 and whose memory we celebrate on May 1st. Even to this day, there are descendants of the Turkic tribes, which, as mentioned earlier, are often called Tatars, who still consider themselves Tatar. These tribes converted in the century after the Russians captured Kazan in 1552. One such group is known as the Kriashins. There are an estimated 200,000 of them, although the official Russian census numbers mark them around 35,000 because ethnicities are counted by speakers of said ethnicity's language instead of who identifies themselves as such. The Russian Church has numerous Kriashin clergy, and many parish hold services in Tatar language for those who feel more comfortable in it than in Russian. In fact, in this video clip, you can see a native Tatar clergyman and Tatar congregation celebrating Pascha in 2021.
Христос перелеп торган. Христос өлгененен терелеп торган. Өлгенеге белен ölümden kötün bitergen.
Another Turkic ethnic group that converted to Orthodoxy at the same time as the Kriashins are the Chuvash people, who, though they currently number around 1.5 million speakers of Chuvash, they used to be a much larger group. Their downfall is that they tend to be easily absorbed into Russian society due to the fact that they have fair skin and light-colored hair. Most of them live within the Archdiocese of Chuvashia, which includes 3 dioceses, 7 deaneries, 4 monasteries, and a seminary, among a total of more than 200 parishes. Both the Chuvash and the Croatians are descendants of those people who had comprised the Volga-Bulgar state that had converted to Islam in the 10th century and was obliterated during the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. The Gogaz Turks, who live primarily in the Republic of Moldova, number around 220,000 worldwide. It is unclear when they converted, but their dialect of Turkish indicates they originated northeast of the Black Sea, but were pushed west by the Kuman-Kipchak Confederation starting in the 11th through 13th centuries. Arriving in the Balkans shortly before waves of Kuman-Kipchaks who were displaced by the Mongols, the Gogaz integrated and adopted Orthodox Christianity. While on the topic of Moldavia, it is noteworthy that the Ottoman Prince of Moldavia, Prince Stefan Razvan, converted to Orthodox Christianity before his death in 1595. Another convert to Orthodoxy and Prince of Moldavia, though short-lived, was the Italian Croat Gaspar Graziani, who ruled only 1 year before dying in 1620. Similarly, a ruler of nearby Wallachia, Catherine Salvaresso, was the wife of Prince Alexandru Mircea II, and thereby Princess of Wallachia. She is famous for founding the first printing press in Bucharest in 1573, in order to print primarily liturgical books. Further, she was instrumental in founding the women's monastery of Slati Aurela. She reposed in 1590. In the same vein, there were a number of Byzantine empresses who were converts from Catholicism, such as Saint Irene of Hungary, who was married to Emperor John Komnenos II. She was known for being a dedicated mother who had little to no interest in government or court intrigue, but instead encouraging her husband to construct the monastery of Christ Pantocrator in Constantinople, which contained within it 3 churches and a gigantic hospital. She reposed in the Lord in 1134, and her feast day is August 13th. Next was Bertha of Sulzbach, who married Manuel Komnenos I. When she died in 1159, Manuel married another convert from Catholicism, Maria of Antioch. Unfortunately, Maria was killed in 1182 during the massacre of the Latins in Constantinople. Next was Yolande of Montferrat, who was another convert from Catholicism. She married Emperor Andronikos Palaiologos II and died in 1317. Irene of Brunswick was yet another. She was the first wife of Andronikos Palaiologos III. When she died, Andronikos III married another Western noblewoman, Anna of Savoy, who converted to Orthodoxy. She died in 1365. There is also Rita of Armenia, the wife of co-emperor Michael IX, who, though not Roman Catholic, was a convert from the Armenian Church. She reposed in 1333. Now, one will correctly point out that most of these conversions were purely due to politically arranged marriages, and though we can say that is a given, it does not affect the fact that the Orthodox Church demanded these people convert in order to marry, and thus shows that at the very least, we are insistent on accepting converts. In this video, we have given what is really a brief survey of Orthodox Christian missions starting after the Great Schism of 1054 up until the early 17th century, and in the following videos, God willing, we will continue where we have left off, following those missions, across the Ural Mountains, and into eastern Russia, and from there into China, Korea, and Japan, while simultaneously entering North America and reaching as far south as Central California. We will also discuss the missionary work done in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North America to bring the Uniates back into the fold of Orthodox Christianity, with many of those missionaries experiencing beatings, imprisonment, torture, and ultimately martyrdom for the cause of the Orthodox Church. We would like to thank our Patreon subscribers for their generous support, as their subscriptions allow us to purchase the materials necessary to research, write, record, and create these videos. As a Patreon subscriber, you have unique access to material most viewers lack access to, and you are able to message us with questions whenever you have them.